Good evening and welcome back to another edition of Book Reviews. Today is Sunday, August 4th, 2019 on the Gregorian calendar, and it's been a long time since we've done any book reviews together, so we have a lot to get through. Hopefully it doesn't take too long. We're going to start with How Social Movements Die by Christian Davenport. This is a sociological study of how social movements die, and it takes the Republic of New Africa, which was an organization back in the 70s, as kind of a case study because they were repressed by the government. And that is an example of how social movements die. Unfortunately, this book is a sociology, which was not really that interesting to me. I think straight up history would have been better, because as I was reading it, I was trying to pull a history out of a sociology, and that was kind of a pain. But this is a very important piece of history, especially in as much as it connects to the death of the civil rights movement, the birth of the Black Power movement, and the connections to the political prisoner struggle, and also to what ended up happening in Jackson, Mississippi, which is alluded to here. So there's not very many books out there about the Republic of New Africa. It's just kind of mentioned in some of these books, but this is the most detailed account that is available on the market about the Republic of New Africa. So if you're looking for information about the Republic of New Africa, this is a pretty good place to look. How Social Movements Die. This one I was reading it in Cuba, so this is a long time ago that I finished this one. Moving on to The Killing of Tupac Shakur. For some reason, I decided I need to study Tupac, and this one was, it's a trade paperback, so it's very readily available. It's by Cathy Scott. She was a journalist in Las Vegas, and so she had been following the story for the newspaper she was working for at the time. So it's got a little bit of that journalism, a little bit of that kind of crime, like those crime writers. Not much on social content or cultural relevance, or going really deeply beneath the surface to talk about what it means, especially in terms of the social movements for a poet and a performer and artist like Tupac to have been killed in Vegas. So I'm sure there's other better books about Tupac than this one. It was just not very. It was a little bit of a superficial look at that issue for me. This is another book that we were also reading in Cuba, or in preparation for. I think we finished it when we got back. This is when we were reading together, my partner and I. It's called The Santería Experience. It's by Migene González-Wippler. This is the second book that she wrote about Santería, and the way she writes it, she's Boricua, Puerto Rican, taught about Santería by her caretaker, her babysitter, or kind of her nanny in Puerto Rico, and then later on she's kind of reintroduced to the religion. It's an insider's look at Santería, and it really, I think it's useful in helping understand like what the rituals of Santería are. I think the last chapter is about possession. So it has a lot of personal experience, personal accounts of the author's, just her religious experience with Santería. Really, Santería is just kind of like a New World version of the Yoruba religion. So if you're interested in Santería or Candomblé or any of the kind of the expressions of Yoruba religion in the Americas, then this is probably not a bad book to read. But if you're interested in Yoruba religion, it's probably better to just read about the Yoruba religion. So, but if you're going to Cuba, might not be a bad idea. This one I think we also took to Cuba with us. Revolution at Point Zero. This is by Silvia Federici. This one was really interesting from the point of view of just having a deeper understanding of what social reproduction is. I think a lot of Marxist theorists or economists. They write a lot about production. They write about the economy from the point of view of production and labor, without really ever looking at the issue of where does labor come from, where does the working class come from, and of course it's socially reproduced, and that is the work that is done by and large predominantly by women. And so how is that labor valued? In capitalism, it's not. So this is a series of essays that she wrote from, some of them in collaboration with other writers, from like the 70s on up until the late, I guess the last one is 2010, of these essays. And so it's kind of that same idea of what is social reproduction, what is the wages for housework campaign, updated for each new economic reality over the years. So, in some ways it gets a little bit repetitive, but very illustrative in terms of, what is a kind of a Marxist feminist approach to this, to economics and to, this idea of social reproduction. So, if you're looking for an intro, this is a good place to start. This book is called Leila Khaled. It's by Icon of Palestinian Liberation. It's by Sarah Irving. This is part of a series of books about revolutionaries, and they have just really kind of short biographies of many different revolutionary figures over throughout history. This is I think is the only one that's about a woman, and so for those that don't know, Leila Khaled is I should say, but she's still alive. But she was very involved in the Palestinian liberation struggle, in the 70s. She was part of the PFLP, which is a Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. They eventually became part of the PLO, one of the major organizations as part of the PLO. They were Marxist, kind of Marxist nationalist in their orientation. And Leila Khaled's claim to fame is her involvement in a couple of air hijackings, in which nobody was hurt, but they were very important in raising the profile of the Palestinian struggle at a time when they were, couldn't get any coverage in the Western media. So it was successful in that. In some ways, it also kind of helped create this picture or this stereotype or this image of Palestinians who are using, radical tactics like terrorism and that sort of thing, to advance their cause. And so she has written about some of the regrets that she has about that. So very it's a book that will help you understand who Leila Khaled is, and what her struggle was in the 60s and 70s, and it kind of pretty much goes up to modern times where she's involved in the International League of People's Struggles and that sort of thing. So, but of course her role has been much reduced. Doesn't have as much of a leadership role after after PFLP. She kind of got more in like the women's movement in Palestine. So Leila Khaled. This book is called Loaded. It's by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. The subtitle is A Disarming History of the Second Amendment. I got this one on my birthday last year, actually, and decided to read it mostly because I got invited to speak about I got invited to speak at a rally against gun violence, from the perspective of the police use of guns, and what is the kind of what is the police gun violence factor or component of the larger gun violence issue. I think I had actually already started reading it when I got that invitation, but it did give me a very solid basis upon which to speak when I did go speak at that rally at Cal State San Bernardino. And for those of you that are familiar with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz's work, that that she really roots her scholarship in the framework of settler colonialism, of indigenous sovereignty, and that's really her perspective, and kind of really breaking down what is the relationship between the Second Amendment and mass violence. These mass shootings that are unfortunately so in the news right now and are so heartbreaking to see unfold. And that's really her take on it, is that the people that kind of helped generate this gun culture were settlers. These rangers. They were people that were invading the Appalachians at a time when they weren't supposed to because of international treaties and stuff like that. They didn't care. The reason they did it was to advance white supremacy and to settle and for money, to make money. They were land speculators and real estate agents and stuff like that. And this was hyped up through literature and the Last of the Mohicans, that series of books, and that continued especially after the Civil War. Those people that became outlaws, these Jesse James type people, they were Confederate, irregular soldiers, Confederates that were fighting for slavery and for white supremacy. And she really, makes it clear that there's a through line between the original settlers of this continent and the mass violence that we have going on today with all these horrible mass shootings. So definitely recommended, especially if you're interested in gun violence, interested in looking at this issue of the Second Amendment and white supremacy, especially from a Native viewpoint. This was a next book. It's called The Occult Features of Anarchism. The subtitle is With Attention to the Conspiracy of Kings and the Conspiracy of the Peoples. It's by Erica Lagalisse. And I saw this one pop up in an email, I think, from PM Press, because they're the ones that are selling it. And I was just really intrigued by it. So I ordered it and read it very quickly. And part of the reason I was intrigued is because I've looked into this issue of, secret societies, esotericism, the occult, before, and for the most part I found it was kind of a rabbit hole, and I guess I share some of the critiques that sociologists have about people who engage in conspiracy theory, in that, well, I guess maybe more activists have, is that it's very demobilizing. If you believe that everything is predetermined by some secret society that has a conspiracy to rule the world, then what you do doesn't matter. Popular action doesn't matter. Getting involved, organizing, it doesn't matter. And I don't believe that at all. Which is why it was interesting to hear Erica Lagalisse's take on it, because she comes out of anarchist community in Montreal, I think, somewhere in Canada, that was involved in international solidarity work, especially Zapatista solidarity work in the mid-late 90s. And so her interest in the Freemasons and the Illuminati and all that comes out of exchange with Mexican activists, indigenous activists. So just the fact that she's able to kind of narrate this journey of how she began this study gives you a point of reference and something to relate to, or did to me. And she has a feminist analysis. She has a class analysis, because a lot of times the people that criticize people that have conspiracy theories are doing it so from the point of view of having a formal education, a university education. There's a lot of machismo, there's a lot of male supremacy, patriarchy that comes along with those kind of privileges. And so she's looking for ways to kind of validate working class perspectives, but also kind of break down this concept that a lot of people have, that a lot of this stuff is preordained. And the way she does it is really talking about what is the history of, especially like the Illuminati, and how that secret society came out of the guilds that were forming in the city, when Europe was becoming urbanized, and how those folks kind of really started to resist the fact that they were being controlled by the aristocracy and the church. So people now talk about the Illuminati as if like they were financing Black Lives Matter and stuff like that, where really the opposite is true. These were popular movements, people's movements that did their stuff in secret, and that's why the kings came up with this conspiracy of kings, to try to regain control. So definitely an interesting take on the whole issue of conspiracy theories, secret societies, and the occult. It's pretty short too. Very interesting. This next book is called SNCC, The New Abolitionists by Howard Zinn. This is one that I and my partner read together. I've had a long fascination with the civil rights movement, and of course SNCC was very fundamental to that. larger movement, and especially in the way that the civil rights movement gave birth to the Black Power movement. And I've found really fascinating that when SNCC was first created, when it was first born, it was intentionally a multiracial organization, and then part of the history is the split, really, between white folks going to organize white folks and black folks continuing to organize black folks and moving into Black Power. Howard Zinn was there when a lot of this stuff was going down, and he writes about, in sometimes very gory detail, about the intensity of the violence against the civil rights workers of all colors, but it was very violent, and that's something that I find is a lot of times glossed over, even if you study Dr. Martin Luther King or the Montgomery bus boycott. There's some of these flashpoints along the way in the civil rights movement. Unless you actually really get into the day-to-day of the struggle of civil rights in the South, like this book does, and some of the other books about civil rights movement from people's experience and their personal experience, then you never understand the intensity of the white backlash against civil rights. People wanted to do something so basic as vote. So I mean, it's tough to read that level of detail, about the violence, but it's very, very inspiring to hear the stories of the young people that were involved in that struggle, and many of them went on to do, great and wonderful things. And this is kind of like the beginning of those stories, which are later on told in some of these other books that are autobiographies or memoirs. So SNCC, The New Abolitionists, it's a must-read for anybody that is studying race or in the United States, or civil rights movement or Black Power movement. We're going to go next to An Indigenous People's History of the United States. This one's also by Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. I have had this one in my library for a little while now, thanks to Connie St. Jean, the activist. So thank you very much, Connie, for this book. You gave it to me in 2016, and I finally got around to reading it this year. There's a lot of, kind of these two stories of the Second Amendment and the history, how this continent was colonized. There's a lot of, those two stories are interwoven. So you can really see that when you parallel this one with Loaded. Obviously, they're by the same author. So what can I say? I mean, it has a lot of also detail about some of these specific massacres and initiatives of the white settlers in different parts of this continent. And most of it I was already familiar with from reading a lot of these other books, but there was a few historical episodes that I had not been familiar with, so it was good to learn about those. So this is actually a good place to start, kind of a jumping off point, and then there's plenty of references for, delving deeper into any one of these specific either historical incidents or communities that were experiencing them. So yeah, I always recommend Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz's books. This one was good. This is the one that I just finished not too long ago. It's called Rhodakanaty y la formación del pensamiento socialista en México. And the reason I picked this one up is because this guy, Rhodakanaty, was referenced in Erika Lagalisse's book. She does a decent study of the history of socialism and anarchism in Mexico, as it relates to her thesis in Occult Features of Anarchism. So one of the other things that Erika Lagalisse talks about in this book is how anarchists, especially because of their atheism, that kind of Marxist, their disorientation away from religion or against religion that's rooted in Marxism, also is pretty classist and disrespectful towards people of faith or people that have beliefs, whether they're religious beliefs or just metaphysical beliefs, things that just really can't be proven by science or disproven, for that matter. And Rhodakanaty was one of those people. So he was, not really easy to pigeonhole as being an anarchist or a socialist, because we're talking about like the 1860s, 1870s in Mexico. But he was also, somebody that was very deeply rooted in spiritual principles, Christianity, especially. And, this is at a time when socialism was, pretty new. Before Marx even published, the Communist Manifesto. So, Erika Lagalisse is talking about Rhodakanaty as somebody whose philosophy had the potential to maybe not exclude spiritual or religious perspectives from a concept of anarchism or socialism, and in a third world country. His life story is kind of told through this. It's pretty interesting. He was a Greek immigrant to Mexico, and his development of his thought over the years is pretty interesting. At a certain point, he joins the Church of Latter-day Saints because the Mormons were doing a lot of missionizing in Mexico. This is a time that Mormonism was pretty new, and it's actually the reason why I ended up getting this book right here, Early Mormonism and the Magic View, because some of the studies that I've made of that religion have shown that there's some overlap or some parallels between in the symbols or the rituals of Freemasonry and the LDS Church. And so, the fact that this scholar, who was formerly LDS, I think he kind of got kicked out of the church, wrote about the worldview that a lot of people in the United States were coming from that ended up going into the LDS Church. And then, it kind of intersects with what Rhodakanaty was doing in terms of religion and socialism, was just pretty interesting. And he ended up, leaving the church, and really more, because it basically wasn't socialist enough for him. But yeah, this one took me a while to read because it is in Spanish, and I just read a little bit slower in Spanish. But the other interesting thing about this book is that there was a lot of peasant rebellions, campesinos, rising up in arms. This is even before the Porfiriato, so this concept that the revolution in Mexico began in 1910 is really anachronistic, because there was a long history of especially peasant struggle in Mexico long before the revolution. There was a lot of revolutionary ideas and activity going on a long time before the quote-unquote official beginning of the revolution in 1910. So interesting book, and a little-known historical figure from the history of philosophy in Mexico. And then this other one that I just finished reading is called Cradles of the Native Americans. There's some books out there about cradle boards, and this one is pretty old. It's a reprint of an essay from like 1880s or something like that. So some of the language is very outdated. It calls people coming from native communities savages in some parts, for example. But it's very and it's very similar to what you might read in like a museum exhibit book. A lot of the a lot of the content is based on examples of cradle boards that are held in museums. So it's very technical in terms of like weaving styles and materials, except the actual botany. It only mentions once or twice specific plants that are used, which the